The Hayholt was older by far than all the generations of Erkenlandish peasants who had been born, labored, and died in the fields and villages surrounding the Great Keep. The Erkenlanders were only the latest to claim the castle. Many others had called it their own, but none had been able to make it wholly so. The outer wall around the sprawling keep showed the work of diverse hands and times. The rough-hewn rock and timber of the Rimmer's men, the haphazard patching and strange carvings of the Hernestiri, even the meticulous stonework of the Nabanai craftsmen. But looming over all stood Green Angel Tower, erected by the undying Scythi long before men had come to these lands, when all of Ostenard had been their domain. The Scythi had been the first to build here, constructing their primeval stronghold on the headlands overlooking the Kinslash and the river road to the sea. They had called their castle Aswa. If it had a true name, this house of many masters, then Aswa was that name. The fair folk had vanished now, from the grassy plains and rolling hill country, fled mostly to the woods and craggy mountains and other dark places inconvenient to men. The bones of their castle, a home to usurpers, remained behind. So that's a little taste of Ostenard, the world in which the Dragonbone Chair is set. And if you haven't guessed it already, we're here to talk a little bit about Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, perhaps the most influential series on George R.R. Martin, author of A Song of Ice and Fire. The book series was started in 1988 by author Tad Williams, who shares absolutely no resemblance to Stone Cold Steve Austin. Williams had been a lifelong fantasy reader outside of being an author, but had become disillusioned with the seeming rehashings of Lord of the Rings that were clogging up the fantasy community at the time. And so he took it upon himself to do one better and write a fantasy series that would bring something new to the genre. And while obviously I'm not all the way through the book yet, I can say that he certainly does bring an awful lot to the table, and this is definitely why George R. R. Martin chose to pull so heavily from him. I put up that quote earlier that George R. R. Martin made about Tad Williams' work when he read it, and how it had inspired him a bit to start working in the medium of fantasy. So what's the Dragonbone Chair about? What's it like? Who's in it? And how does it stack up to the works that it inspired by authorial titan George R. R. Martin? Well, so far Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn has followed the life of Simon predominantly. However, it does make shifts to other characters, including, but not limited to, a somewhat dwarfish old jester, who is one of my favorite characters, Towser, a rather charming and fatherly old duke who appears to be embroiled in some sort of espionage schemes against the evils controlling the king, by the name of a Scribner, who happens to embody many of the characteristics of Northmen we see in the Song of Ice and Fire book series, and who happens to be a Rimmersman. And we even spend a flash of time in the head of Rachel the Dragon, the mistress of the castle keepers. She's essentially the head castle maid. These transitions can be a little different than the way George R. R. Martin presents things because he doesn't break up the chapters by character perspective. You can somewhat seamlessly slip from one character's mind into another character's mind, almost in scene. Fundamentally, Ostenard is going through a transition. The older king, Prester John, who essentially unified the kingdom and was the slayer of the dragon that was used to create the Dragonbone Chair, has passed on. His sons have come to court, and his eldest, Elias, has assumed the kingship. The younger, Joshua, who is missing a hand for some unknown reason at this time, but for some reason that has to do with the death of Elias's wife, so it's very serious, has gone missing. And where I'm at in the book series, this is where our main man, Simon, has been embroiled into the larger plot that's occurring. We come to realize that the Red Priest, who I'd mentioned in a previous video, Pirates, was involved in some sort of scheme that involved the imprisonment of the young prince. Obviously, there's a lot more stuff a-brewin', but I don't want to ruin all that. So returning to Simon, our young lad has been raised in the castle for most of his life and has no real direction, one would say. He's an air-headed youth, many think, but mostly he's a dreamer who likes to think of himself in better places, doing more interesting things, and who dreams of glory and honor and being a knight and all that shit that you dream about when you're a young nerd. Simon's past has been kept mysterious from us, but he has some kind of interesting connection to the castle and the Dragonbone Chair itself that I'm sure will lead to some interesting revelations in the future. Additionally, the kingdom of Ostenard itself is falling into great disrepair and chaos, as we learn from the Duke of Scribnor when he's attempting to convince the king to let him do something about it. We also know from the Duke's perspective that the kingdom isn't exactly entirely loyal to Elias. Okay, so I promised you some fun comparisons, and I promised to go over who the Rimmersmen are. So I'm going to read for you a brief section about the Rimmersmen, as told to Simon by one of my other favorite characters, Dr. Morganes, of whom we will also be speaking more of shortly. Well, the land seemed quite big enough for all to share, until black iron came over the water. What? Black iron? Simon was immediately stilled by the doctor's sharp look. The shipmen of the near-forgotten West, the Rimmersmen, Morganes continued. They landed in the north, armed men fierce as bears, riding in their long serpent boats. The Rimmersmen? Simon wondered. Like Duke Iskranor at the court, on boats? They were great seafarers before they settled here, the Duke's ancestors, Morganes affirmed. But when they came, they were not searching for grazing or farming lands, but for plunder. More importantly, though, they brought iron, or at least the secret of shaping it. They made iron swords and spears, weapons that would not break like the bronze of Ostenard, weapons that could beat down even the witchwood of the city. Morganes rose and refilled his beaker from a covered bucket standing on a cathedral of books beside the wall. Instead of returning it to the table, he stopped to finger the shiny epaulets of the armor suit. None stood against them for long. The cold, hard spirit of the iron seemed in the shipmen themselves as much as their blades. Many folks fled south, moving close to the protection of Nabban's frontier outposts. The Nabbanai Legion's well-organized garrison forces resisted for a while. Finally, they too were forced to abandon the Frost March to the Rimmersmen. There was much slaughter. My guess is you're getting pretty big Andal vibes. Because yes, the Rimmersmen give off pretty big Andal vibes. Or maybe it's the reverse. The Andals give off pretty big Rimmersmen vibes. And the Rimmersmen are far from the only super similar crossover here. You see, the predominant religion in Ostenard is the Adonite religion, which is a clone of Christianity that's been modified in some pretty fun ways. Their version of Christ, for example, was nailed to and hung from a tree. And the sword Bright Nail actually contains one of the nails that was used to hang their Lord and Savior from the tree. I'd also like to note that the tree the Savior was nailed to in the Adonite religion is a white tree. This new religion, which on its surface in many ways resembles the Faith of the Seven, has offset the older pantheon of gods, which are in both cases referred to as the Old Gods. Now, I brought that up in my previous video, so if you saw that, that won't be new information. However, a few new things that have cropped up that you might find interesting are the tunnels under the Hayholt, which to me mirror the mazes of tunnels underneath the Red Keep, and they also remind me of the tunnels in Bloodraven's cave. Where am I now? How could Hayholt run so deep? Doctor said castles under castles, down into the world's bones. Castles under castles, under castles. We also have the Kingswood, which is very similar to the Kingswood. It's a small forest located not that far from the Hayholt itself. Our characters actually go there on a mushroom hunt and make an interesting discovery that drives the plot. I'll give you a hint. The Kingswood can be as dangerous as the Kingswood. Tad Williams also loves rushes in a way that only George R.R. Martin could truly embody. And if there's any one most consistently direct rip from this book series, it's the use of rushes. Joking aside, you probably noticed that in my reading, the previous men who occupied Ostenard were bronze wielders. And that, of course, is highly reminiscent of the bronze-wielding first men that were able to live alongside the Children of the Forest, and even the giants, it would seem, where the Andals would later not be able to. Last little fun similarities that I brought up previously is the connections to the Stannis story. We obviously have the Red Priest that I mentioned in the past video, Pirates. And Pirates is portrayed as a character manipulating the king. This king is very similar to Stannis, and they have a brusque personality, off-puttishness, and problems with their brother in a very similar way that Stannis does. Honestly, I could see King Elias and King Stannis palling around quite a lot until their similarities in personalities caused an inevitable conflict. Back to my boy Dr. Morganes. So Dr. Morganes is in many ways a maester, or probably a proto-maester. Definitely a lot of influence on what George R. R. Martin's maesters would be. He is referred to as a doctor, and he is a man of science who also knows about magic. Magic's true nature is still a little bit mysterious. We do see Morganes use some pretty potent shit that I will say supersedes anything we see in the Song of Ice and Fire, at least the way it's presented. Lastly, in our little similarity train here, we should talk about the elephant in the room, the Dragonbone Chair. Now, the Dragonbone Chair was constructed from the bones of a slain dragon that was plaguing the realm, Much like how Aegon the Conqueror's chair was constructed from the fallen swords of his enemies. It's kind of a foes, corpses equals your seat sort of thing. The chair is massive, impressive, intimidating, and embodies many of the properties we see in the Iron Throne. And much like how the throne was built by the Conqueror himself, the chair was built at the behest of Prester John, the king who slew the dragon and solidified the kingdom the story now takes place in. When I think of Prester John and his white hair and his many battles and his accomplishments, it makes me think a lot of Targaryen kings, and I can only imagine that many of the ideas surrounding Targaryen kings were pulled from Prester John. And then there's all of this shit. The deep gloom of the chambers bent crazily at the corners of his sight, and his head pounded. The ceaseless sound of falling water began to feel like hammer blows to his reeling mind. His voices came chittering back, revelers excited by the wild music.
Mad! The boy is mad! Have pity! He's lost, lost, lost. We will have it back, man-child. We will have it all back. Mad moon calf!
And as he passed down yet one more sloping tunnel, he began to hear other voices in his head, voices he had not heard before, somehow both more real and more unreal than those which had long been his unwanted companions. Some of these shouted in languages he did not know, unless he had glimpsed them in the doctor's ancient books.
Ruka, Ruka Aswa, Tisi Eshia, Asingru. The trees are burning. Where is the prince? The witchwood is in flames. The gardens are burning.
The half-darkness was contorting around him, bending as though he stood at the center of a spinning wheel. He turned and stumbled blindly down a passageway, and into one more lofty hall, holding his agonized head in his hands. There was other, different light here. Thin blue beams angled down from the cracks in the unseen ceiling above. Light that pierced the darkness, but illuminated nothing where it fell. He smelled more water, and strange vegetation. He heard men running, shouting, women crying, in the ring of metal on metal. In the strange, almost blackness, the sound of some terrible battle raged all around him, but it did not touch him. He screamed, or thought he did, but he could not hear his own voice, only the ghastly din in his head. Then, as if to confirm his already certain madness, dim figures began to rush past in the blue-lace darkness, bearded men with torches and axes chasing others more slender who bore swords and bows. All of them, pursuers and pursued, were transparent and ill-defined as mist. None touched or saw Simon, although he stood squarely in their midst.
Jingazul, Alaf, O Jingazul,
came a wailing cry.
Kill the Scythian demons!
Harsher voices shouted.
Put fire to their nest!
Hands clutched tight over his ears, he could not keep the voices away. He stumbled forward, trying to escape the swirling shapes, and fell through a doorway, coming to rest at last on the flat landing of gleaming white stone. He could feel cushioning moss beneath his groping hands, but his eyes saw nothing but polished blankness. He crawled forward on his stomach, still trying to escape the horrible voices shrieking in pain and anger. His fingers felt cracks and pits, but still the stone looked as flawless as glass. He reached up and stared out across a great leveled field of black emptiness which smelled of time and death and the patient ocean. An invisible pebble rolled from beneath his hand to fall silently for long moments, and then splash into the depths below. Okay, so comparisons aside, how in my honest opinion does this stack up against A Song of Ice and Fire? Extremely well. I have to say that I have not really been disappointed at all once so far, and it's only getting better and better and better. There's mystery, there's intrigue, there's what could probably be magic, there's murders, there's all kinds of wild stuff, and there's a few things that I think I've caught on to that are probably obviously hinted at, but there's a few other things that are developing too that have definitely caught my attention. And there certainly is a pretty awesome backdrop and undercurrent of plot going on here when it comes to the world itself. This series is incredibly engaging and absolutely a worthy predecessor and influencer on something as potent as A Song of Ice and Fire. People should definitely be giving Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn a read, a chance, and the respect it deserves. And, frankly, it should get some spotlight for the amount of influence it had on George R. R. Martin and the book series. So, hopefully I provided some of that spotlight. Hopefully I've convinced you to go out there and read it. But yeah, let me know what you think. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this little video. I'm going to close it out with a couple more seconds of reading about the Scythi so you can have something else to think on.
What about the Scythi? You said they had no iron? It was deadly to them.
The doctor licked his finger and rubbed away a spot on the polished wood of the breastplate.
Even they could not defeat the Rimmer's men in open battle. But
He pointed the dusty finger at Simon, as if this fact concerned him personally.
But the Scythi knew their land. They were close to it, a part of it even, in a way the invaders could never be. They held their own for a long time, falling slowly back on places of strength. The chiefest of these, and for the reason of this whole discussion, was Aswa, the Hayholt.